What is the scariest paranormal experience you ever had? My grandfather told me this story about how one time he was sitting in a chair in front of the house, when he heard his wife repeatedly calling him from inside the house. The thing is, my grandmother passed away a few years before that, but he told me that the voice was so pressing that he actually got up to look inside the house, and as soon as he got inside he heard a loud crash behind him and turned around to see that the chair he has been sitting in moments ago had been crushed by the cast iron gutter that fell on it. If he didn't came inside the house he would have probably been seriously injured.
I don't know if it's paranormal or not, but every time I think about it sends chills down my spine.
When I was around 12 my mother had to go out of town for a bit and she left me home alone for a few days. We lived close to relatives, so it wasn't a big deal back then. She refused to give me a mobile phone because she figured she could just call me on the landline if anything came up. She told me the date when she'd be back and that was that. The date arrives and I hear my mom knocking on the door downstairs, calling my name. My dog, who loved her, got excited when she heard her voice and ran down ahead to greet her. She got to the door, freaked the hell out and ran back upstairs to me. I refused to go down and open the door. The phone started ringing and the knocking stopped. I picked up the phone to hear my mom say, "Hey, I'm sorry, I have to stay one more day here. I'll head home tomorrow." My nephew lives with me in an old farmhouse built in the 1840s. When he was about 4, maybe 5, he told me that there was a little boy named Charlie who lived in our house. He said Charlie had never heard of video games and that Charlie's dad left him home all by himself. This was around the same time that he had an imaginary friend named Mr. Cat, who was an anthropomorphic cat, so I wrote it off.
A couple weeks later I was shaving with the bathroom door open and thought I could see my nephew kind of looking in at me out of the corner of my eye.
I stuck my head around and could see him from behind messing with an old china cabinet we keep important stuff in, and just as I walked into the room, I could see my nephew sitting in the living room watching TV. He couldn't have crossed that much distance that fast or silently.
I asked him about it, and he said, "Oh yeah, that was Charlie."
He says there's a really super book in there from when you were a little boy. And at the bottom of a stack of old documents and stuff in the china cabinet is a book I got as a gift when I was a kid. I didn't even know it was there. It was under 2 boxes of documents and couldn't been seen until the boxes were lifted out. The little boy didn't look like you think of ghosts. He wasn't transparent. He didn't float. He didn't look spooky. He just looked like a kid. Now I'm convinced that people see ghosts, or whatever they are, every day and don't realize it because they look just as real as we do. This one isn't necessarily scary, but definitely paranormal. I was 14 and sitting by myself in my living room playing some Halo, when I noticed that the room around me seemed oddly quiet. I paused the game and tried to listen for the difference. It was strange. My house is over 100 years old and usually there's an odd creak audible from somewhere nearby. Not now though, it was dead quiet. I felt strange, but not threatened. There was nothing sinister about the silence. I sat for a few more minutes just listening. It almost felt peaceful actually. Then suddenly I felt a hand on my shoulder, very lightly and briefly, but even today I still remember the distinct feeling of a hand on my shoulder. It didn't scare me, nor did I jump up in surprise. I actually felt a familiar presence. Like family. I mentioned the experience to my mom, and she told me she had experienced the same thing, only one room over. She says she felt her father's presence with the hand. When I was about a kid growing up with my mom and dad, my dad is black, mom isn't, I always knew that I had a strange heritage and family history. I'm born Scandinavian, specifically Danish, so is my mom. My dad was born and raised a majority of his life in Tanzania. He is technically chief of the Maasai tribe he grew up in after his father passed away. His father's name was Anali. The belief is that I am the reincarnation of Anali as I am the firstborn boy of my father's children. That fact was always something my dad told me, but as a kid I just thought it as kind of cool. I never really thought about it too much, but I never really believed I had any real connection to Anali. He also died before I was born. When I turned about 11 or 12 I had some weird obsession with the 3rd of April. I still don't know why, but to this day it just seems like the perfect date to me. I started thinking about that date often and my mom even told me she heard me say it in my sleep once or twice when she came in to check on me. When I turned 14, I was taking a walk with my dad and said something along the lines of, "I wish my birthday is on the 3rd of April. My dad stood dead still and looked at me, sat me down and started asking me questions like, why that date or what's so special about that date? I started to realize there was no real reason and that it just felt right to me. He told me that that was the day his dad, Anali, had died, and I was kind of freaked out about it. A week later, I woke up and I kid you not, I saw a person sitting on the end of my bed.
I can't describe it, but it wasn't frightening. It was actually very calming.
It was weird because I knew I should be scared but I just wasn't. He got up and left the room. I laid back down but couldn't sleep again. The next morning, I told my dad about it, and he didn't believe me at first until I started describing how the person looked. My dad's face changed from humoring me to serious. Turns out I had perfectly described his dad. It's a little hard to believe, I know, but I know what I saw. I guess it's time to let this one out. I'm a proud man. Far too proud to admit that ghosts exist or would scare me, but for a couple months I was haunted. It started when I got my Ouija board and I never read the rules. My friends were too scared, so I did it alone. I talked to 2 people that day by myself. One was a little boy named Tim who was disowned by his parents and died in the forest. The other presence was much darker, and for 2 questions I asked, IT would reply death, which was not a valid answer. I got angry with the second one and yelled at IT to prove its malicious nature to me. Nothing happened. I packed the board away, feeling as if maybe it was me the whole time, which is the common notion for disbelievers. But then the next 2 months happened. Between 3 to 4 a.m., I consistently woke up with terror sweats and felt as if I was being watched. About 50 days in, I awoke to the most horrid screaming and a thud so loud I thought someone was breaking in. I jumped up and felt again like someone was in front of me wanting me to die, and yet no sounds from my upstairs housemates. I got so scared that I quit sleeping at night. I would stay up until 6 a.m. at least to make sure that ghost hour wouldn't affect me. But it came anyways. I'll always remember what happened at 2 months.
I was playing Call of Duty as typical for the past 2 weeks and suddenly, I got this cold chill on my back.
And it went to my left shoulder and then also onto the left side of my head. And I kid you not, I heard breathing in my ear. The pressure on my upper left side was if someone or something was leaning its head on my shoulder. I was frightened to death, but I decided F this. I got up, swung my fists, and screamed piss off and go away, and after that night, IT seemed to stay away.
I don't know how all this happened, especially when I was such a non-believer.
Those months feel like a dream. But I do believe now that certain energies do manifest around us, and it's best to stay away from the evil, hurtful ones. This was about 10 years ago, but still gives me chills just thinking about it. My now ex-wife and I had just gotten married and moved into a new neighborhood. We moved in the winter. As spring came, we noticed there were multiple dead animals, birds, squirrels, raccoon, in the yard. We cleaned them all up and started to do improvements to the outside of the house and painting on the inside. I started to notice strange things going on. Keys not where I left them, stuff like that small. I thought I was just being forgetful. Then things slowly started to escalate. While in bed I could swear I could hear a barely audible conversation, like a radio in a far room. As soon as I would try to focus on it, it would go away. I started to hear footsteps at the other end of the house. One night while lying in bed, I hear a huge crash, woke me up out of dead sleep. I went into the kitchen and saw my kid's hamster cage on the floor about 15 feet from where it was. We would put it on the fridge at night, because we had a cat and didn't want it getting to it. Now I know what you are thinking, cat knocked it off. But this cage had to fly over a breakfast bar and a kitchen table to get to its resting place. Then things got ugly. I would be sitting at home watching TV and I would have this uncontrollable thought. What would it be like to be possessed? Or I want to be possessed. I couldn't get this thought out of my head. Couldn't concentrate on anything but that. I would literally have to say in my head, I love God, I love Jesus over and over to get off the original thought.
I need to add that I am not a religious person.
As soon as I would leave the house, I would be fine. Not one thought. But as soon as I pulled in my driveway it would start up again. Uncontrollable. I thought I was going crazy. I sat down with my wife and looked her dear in the eyes and said, I think I'm going crazy, I've been having weird thoughts. She turned white and before I could say any more she said, that you want to be possessed? Come to find out for the past month she had been having the exact same thoughts. Then we started to compare stories. She told me that she was lying in bed without me, I worked seconds at the time, and she could hear a man whispering through the baby monitor while our child was fussing. Needless to say, we moved out within the month. Ate the deposit. Her oldest daughter was still in school, and we had moved across town. I had to pick her up at that house on my days off when she got dropped off by the bus. As soon as I turned the corner, I would get those thoughts. I would sit in my car in the driveway and not even go inside and wait. One night when I was maybe 10 to 12 I had trouble falling asleep. My bedroom was the entire top floor of our house with my bed and such being on the left side and storage closets and a play area being on the right. I was lying in bed when I heard a noise from the other side of the room and see a rocking horse begin to rock. It was sitting just outside one of the storage closet doors. It proceeded to rock its way halfway across the room and stopped dead under the ceiling light. At this point I was freaking out and just buried my head under blankets and never peeked out again until morning. It was all confirmed to not be a dream as the rocking horse was still in the middle of my room when I woke up. Furthermore, I got a stern reprimand from my parents for being up out of bed playing with my toys well past my bedtime. Their bedroom was directly below the storage closet / play area and had heard the creaking of the rocking horse shuffling across the room. Okay, let me start by saying I've never experienced a single paranormal experience in all my 28 years but this one. It happened last year and still haunts me. The fact it is so incredibly intense and real makes it so much crazier. I literally start shaking when I think of it. I've only told 3 or 4 people. Here it goes. Was sleeping next to my girlfriend, now wife. She gets up and starts walking around the room with the lights off. About 5 minutes later she gets back in bed. A few minutes later I feel a little strange and look over at my wife. She's sitting straight up. I turn the light on and ask her what's wrong. I get no answer, no acknowledgement, except she starts to kind of breath loudly.
I say her name a few more times and get very little back from her.
I start to shake her. I'm really scared she's having a stroke or something, and say her name over, and over, and over. She finally looks at me and gets this sneer on her face that freaks me out. This is the first point where I really start to feel like something is really off. I start to say, "What's your name?" as though I'm talking to someone who just hit their head and may not be with it. In other words, I'm asking her to remember her name to try to draw her out of whatever has her head in a fog.
I ask her a few more times, looking in her eyes, when all of a sudden, her pupils dilate to the point where they are black.
I mean fast too, like from normal to black in a split second. Right after this happens, she says the devil. It comes out of her in this voice that is not hers. I freak the out, grab her, and start praying. Like really praying. Commanding God to get whatever the hell has just taken over my wife to get out. About 15 seconds or so, my wife starts crying. I pull back a little, and she just says my name in this terrified, confused little animal voice. I hold her for a few more minutes, then we talk for a few minutes. She basically says she just felt blackness for a while, the remembers coming to in my arms. That's it. So I'm not even that spiritual of a person, or at least I wasn't until that mind-altering night. It all happened so fast too. I still don't know what really happened, but not a single part of me thinks there's some non-spiritual explanation for it. My wife has never had another experience like that, and I've never had another paranormal experience of any kind. My brother thinks she had a mini stroke or something, and from the outside I would surely say the same thing. Needless to say, I didn't sleep well for a while, but as nothing has happened since, my life is entirely back to normal. My parents were on their honeymoon to Key West. When they arrived at the hotel to check in, they were told that the room would be non-smoking. With my dad being a smoker, they requested a different room. They got the room switch and went to their room. As they got off the elevator, the smell of fresh paint was overwhelming. Down the hall there was a painter with all necessary supplies laid out around him and was painting the wall. As my parents walked past him, they casually greeted him and the painter had absolutely no acknowledgement of their presence. Whatever. When they got to their room, the smell of paint was even worse in there, so bad it wasn't even bearable, so they decided to go to the front desk to change rooms. When they explained the situation, the attendant looked very confused and informed them that there wasn't a scheduled paint job on that floor for that day, but agreed to change their room. My parents go back to their floor to grab their luggage and the painter is completely gone. All supplies cleaned up and gone within 10 minutes and the smell of paint was completely gone. At this point my parents were freaked out but didn't think much of it and go to their new room. The next morning on their way to breakfast they overhear a tour guide talking to a group. My parents tuned in when the guide mentioned the floor that they were originally supposed to stay on. Apparently, a long time ago there was a painter on that floor painting and fell down the elevator shaft to his death. Now my parents don't normally believe in the paranormal, but after an event like this that they had no explanation for, it freaked them out a good bit. My middle-aged accountant is a self-proclaimed sensitive from apparently a long lineage of sensitives. She's told me loads of eerie stories that make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. She's a smart, serious, and compassionate woman, so I never doubt her stories for a second. She was telling us the story of how she met her husband. It was when she was 13, and she was playing that I turn 3 times and look in the mirror, and I see the man I'm going to marry game with some girls in the bathroom. Well, she turned 3 times, and saw a man with a mullet and a panther tattoo on his forearm. She remembers being grossed out by him and saying she would never marry that guy. She thought everyone else saw their future man too, so this didn't seem strange that she literally saw the guy she was going to marry in the reflection. Fast forward through 1 failed marriage and starting a real estate business at the age of 40. She goes to a networking event at some bar for real estate. Who does she see in the late 1990s but a guy with a mullet and a panther tat on his forearm? She approaches him and says, "I'm sorry and this will sound crazy but, I think I'm supposed to marry you." Oh, and apparently, he lost some bet, so the mullet was a transient event. Her paranormal experience clued her in that this was the time in her life she would meet her soulmate. Oh, and he's sensitive too. One last story about them that blew my mind. They were driving out to some remote property they'd never seen, and they passed a huge wheat field. Massive. Well, they both felt something breeze through the car that caused him to pull over and go, "Whoa, did you feel that?" Well, he stops the car, opens the door and just starts for the wheat field. Meanwhile she locks up the car, throws on the hazards and just hurries after him. He walks the length of this field, I mean, just plows through it to the line of trees at the back, maybe 3/4 mile from where the car still sits. And then he stops. Huge crumbling graveyard sprawls in front of them. They both get a forbidding feeling, so they get the camera from the car and snap some photos because it was so bizarre. Fast forward to a few months later, they go to a housewarming party where this medium is doing a cleanse on the house. Just for fun, no one is sure if this stuff is real. Anyways, the medium looks at them and says, "You have photos in your glove box. Go get them." Whoa. She flips through them and says, "You can never return to this place. This is where your bodies are from your past lives. Both of you. Yes, you were married before, too. Before I was born, my father and mother had a small apartment together. My mother told me once she went in the basement and saw a woman standing at the base of the steps just staring up at her, and then she just vanished. Then my father was in the shower, one with a sliding glass door that you can barely make out what's on the other side, when a large figure walked up to the other side of the glass and banged on it, making it blow out. My mother found him in the fetal position in the shower, covered in glass, and no one was around. That last one made them move out. He confirmed it happened but doesn't like to talk about it. He's a relatively tough dude, so for something to scare him that much means a lot. Somewhere in between those two occurrences, they came home to find absolutely everything moved over about an inch. They realized this cause they're not very good at dusting. I was told this story when I lived in Haiti after college from somebody who I completely trust. In Haiti there are a lot of stories of people who practice voodoo who can change into animals, especially dogs and birds. My friend was cooking food and feeding it to orphans. They were all around a small fire and she was scooping this stew into people's bowls as they came up. Eventually she started feeding adults since they had leftovers. After that they still had lots left over. Then she noticed an old dog kind of waiting on the other side of the fire looking at her. It was strange because you don't really see dogs in Haiti besides bone-thin mutts. This was a big, healthy-looking older dog. The dog was just looking at her, licking its lips, so she put down a small bowl of stew for the dog. He walked around the fire and ate the food next to her. She didn't think much of it till the next day when she was approached by an older man. "Thank you for the dinner, yesterday." "No problem, but I don't remember you being there. I'm sorry." "You don't remember me? I was there near the end, after you'd fed the children." "Sorry, I guess I forgot." "How did you forget me?" "You looked at me across the fire and then put down a bowl of food for me." I remember feeding somebody's dog, but, of course, that was me." "You do remember. But that was a dog." "Yes, that was me."
"I came after the children had been fed. You'd already served the adults and then you put a bowl of food down next to you and I ate next to you."
They talked for a while and eventually he recounted so many details of the event, plus the dog was so different than any she'd seen there before, that she believed that he was the dog she had fed. "When I was a kid, I did yard work for this incredibly lovely old couple. They told me that when they moved into their house, they had to empty out a few of the rooms and closets of the previous owner's stuff. After that they heard bumping sounds like someone wandering around the house in the dark. They called the previous owners to ask if the sounds were a normal thing. "Oh, you emptied out the upstairs closet, didn't you? Just put the cane back in the closet so he can see where he is going. Without it he just stumbles around bumping into things and making noise." They put the cane back and the noise stopped. They left it in that closet for over 30 years, until they moved out. I was helping them clear the house when I saw this cane. It was a pretty normal wooden cane with a rubber nub on it, but it had these scorch marks on the end like someone used it to poke at a fire. I asked them if this was the cane. They smiled and nodded. My friend's dad is an ex-Marine. He has been a paramedic, firefighter, and security guard, so there's practically nothing on earth that can frighten this man. His family used to live in a very old house built in the 1800s. One day my friend's dad was home alone waiting for the rest of the family to get back with dinner. Now this man is the most honest man I have ever met. There would be no reason to lie about this. He was sitting on the couch downstairs when he says he heard footsteps coming from upstairs. He walks down the main hallway and looks up to their balcony/banister for the upstairs hallway. He then said that there was a shadowy figure that glided across the upstairs railing, from one side to the other, until it was out of view. Right after he saw the supposed apparition, he heard the loudest, most blood-curdling scream he ever heard in his life. Immediately after this scream all of the lights in the house went out and he found himself standing in the pitch black. He then ran out to the front porch and waited for the rest of the family to return. My buddy said that when they got back, he remembers the horrified look on his dad's face. He said he had never seen that look on him and has never seen it since. 2 weeks later they were moved out of the house and moved closer to where I live, which is how we became friends. While this story still gives me the creeps, I can't be too upset because I got my best friend out of the ordeal. My mother, who doesn't believe in any sort of hokey nonsense, once told me a story where one night her and a couple of friends were driving home one night after hanging out, no alcohol involved. They were crossing a bridge when suddenly their car died, and then all the streetlights cut off. Then they heard a throbbing sound, like a large engine idling, and saw a flash of lights cross overhead rapidly. A few moments later, all the lights came back on, and then car started back up immediately. A bit unnerved, they continued home. A few days later, the Pascagoula abduction story was on the news. Apparently, they encountered the same craft that supposedly took those two men. So I was in the 5th or 6th grade hanging out with a friend at his parents' new house that they just finished building. We are in his family-attached 3-car garage looking through boxes from his room in his old house, though I can't recall what we were looking for when he turns to me and says, "Want to see something crazy?" He goes and takes a tennis ball from one of those clear tubes they come in and proceeds to give it a couple tries before successfully throwing it through the crawl space door that leads to a storage space above the garage we are in.
I clearly hear it bounce around and stop.
I don't think anything about it and we continue looking through the boxes in his garage. We are talking to each other when all of a sudden a tennis ball comes flying through the air and smacks the back wall of the garage right between us as we are standing over a box. We both bolted from his garage and went to his room on the other end of the house. He later explained to me that at their old house, located across the street from the recently built new house we're in, had a ghost in the attic that liked to move things around, as in keep things tidy. He said in the past that you could hear the boxes being slowly slid on the floor, ceiling above you, or that you would place something in one place and check on it later and it was in a completely different place in the attic. He believed that the ghost followed them to their new home. All I know is the tennis ball experience freaked the hell out of me and I refused to ever go back into their garage. I haven't told this to anyone yet. This happened maybe 2 years ago. I was asleep taking a nap in the living room, when I woke up to my dad saying, "Watch out for your mom." So I got up, went to look for my mom and found her passed out in the bathroom. She had really high blood pressure, to the point where internal organs were in danger. We could get help fast enough, so things could be settled with medications only. If my dad wouldn't have woken me up, things could have ended worse. He died 5 years prior to that event from leukemia. Okay, I don't believe in ghosts, and I have never had a hallucination like this before. But I still don't know how to explain this. When I was about 13, my little 3-year-old sister woke up in the middle of the night screaming like crazy. It was right across the hall from me, so I woke up. When I looked up, standing in my door was a woman. She had straight black hair a little past her shoulders and was wearing a white dress. Her head was moving in a circular motion like when you're rolling your neck to stretch it. I watched for a few moments as fear set in, then decided to pull the covers over my face. Maybe 30 seconds passed as I panicked with my eyes closed. Then decided to check if it was there. Sure enough, the woman was still standing there, rolling her neck. At this point I said, "Mom. Mom. Mom." Until I was really yelling as loud as I could. My mom rushed up the stairs, reached her hand in my door and flipped on the light switch. At that moment the specter disappeared. For a month after I barely went in my room. I slept on my sister's floor with a sleeping bag. I'm in my 30s now and don't know exactly what to make of it. I'm a sane person and don't really believe in the paranormal but still can't really reconcile that moment. During the summer I tend to sleep on the couch in my basement because it's always nice and cool down there and whatnot. So, I was downstairs one night watching ESPN at about 2 o'clock in the morning. We have hardwood floors upstairs, so whenever someone's walking on them, you can hear them in the basement. Well, that night, out of nowhere I heard what sounding like my dog walking on the floor above me. Problem is that my dog was sitting next to me and I was home alone. Still don't know what the hell that was. I also heard whispers coming from the living room one night as I walked out of the room. That was scary too. My mother's favorite animal was the hummingbird. Last year, shortly after my graduation, she passed away. A hummingbird came right up and looked at me as I was on my way to my car to go to work, like a foot away, and just checked me out for a while and flew off to do hummingbird things. Once I got to my car, I broke down. Just sat there in the driver's seat and cried. I'd like to think my mom was somehow checking up on me.
I know it's silly, but for that moment I felt like she wasn't gone, and she was still there watching over me.
We used to live in a battered women's and children's shelter when I was young, because my father was looking for us. Ugly divorce. Alabama gave him custody. Mom took us to Washington. One night, I looked in the mirror, and saw a hairy demon looking back at me. I screamed and cried and ran to get my mom, who assured me it was a normal mirror. But that night, a kind-looking man, that I can only describe as a ghost, appeared at the end of my bed. He was there all night but gone when I woke up in the morning. Then, the next night, and the next night. He was there every night for 4 months. We never talked, he never moved. Just stood guard. Then, one night he woke me up from my sleep, and I'll never forget how surprised I was, because I'd never seen him move or talk. He said, "He's coming. Get out now." So we packed up the car and left to a hotel for the night. The next morning, we went back to find out someone had broken in and gone room to room looking for someone. I never saw him again after that. Middle of the night, sleeping. I hear a sound like someone is taking a paperclip from my desk and throwing it against the wall, and it bounces across the desk. I wake up to this noise, turn on the light right by my bed as I sit up.
I look over and see nothing.
Weird. As I'm ready to lay back down, my 20-pound steel gumball machine falls from the shelf over my bed directly onto my pillow where my head was not 30 seconds earlier. I flip out and scramble out of my bed as I'm totally taken by surprise. As I stand up, I feel something under my feet. A paperclip. I put the murderous gumball machine on the floor, the paperclip back on my desk, and crawl into the safety of my comforter. Nothing like that happened again. Growing up, my older brother had a computer program that he used to compose piano music on. I remember I was reading in the living room when I heard the most beautiful violin melody I have ever heard. I listened to the whole thing, which was several minutes long. I walked down the hallway to compliment my brother on his masterpiece when I realized my brother was not using the computer, and I was home alone.